my God, this is so fun. Being at Sundance, I've been so excited about doing this. Science versus Fiction is a series where we talk to creative people like filmmakers, scriptwriters, novelists, artists about how science informs their work. When we thought about coming to Sundance, I talked to Dorn. I was like, I really want Jonah. I really hope Jonah will come, and I'm so excited to have you here. It's such a pleasure.
Happy to be here.
One of the most amazing things about looking at your work is you seem infused naturally with a genuine love of science. And you're that rare animal who also finds these dramatic narrative threads and extrapolations from those ideas. And I have to ask if you always loved science, if as a kid you knew you loved science, and if you always loved filmmaking as a kid.
I did love science. I think in another life, I was an extremely mediocre engineer. My uncle Tony was an electrical engineer and taught me how to solder and taught me how to really use my mind to kind of take things apart. I was one of those kids who would always take things apart at inconvenient moments for my parents.
And then when you put them back together, they never worked again? Or did they work again?
It worked with hiccups. But I was the youngest kid in the family, so I was the one it sort of fell to kind of fix everything. Mm-hmm. Chris is fairly handy, and he's good with the camera, but otherwise kind of not so much. So to program the VCR, it was left to me. But I think at a certain point, I realized that there are the things in life that you love and the things in life that you're talented at. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure I had a talent for science so much as an affection for it.
Now, I find it very interesting as an audience member watching your films is I'm first and foremost swept up in the cinema, right? I'm lost in the microcosm and in the story. And then underneath, I see there's this like architecture of these conceptual scientific themes. I can see it in every piece of yours that I've had the privilege of watching. And I wonder if it's that intentional in your process. Do you get excited about some crazy quantum theory and then start dreaming of a narrative, or do they kind of come together naturally?
Yeah, I've always been a little suspicious of the term. I say process. It's the last little bit of England that's left in me. But I've always been suspicious of the word process because I don't know what that means, and I've been trying for 20 years to figure out what that means. Mm-hmm. You get interested in things. I read a lot, and you get taken with things. I think a lot of people think that the things that I work on, the things that I worked on with Chris, are sort of more cerebral than emotional in that sort of space. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I do think that we tend to, on the great axis of writing from character to story, I'm definitely over here somewhere. I will get interested in a character. The Dark Knight was written basically sort of with the Joker as this sort of person of fascination at the center of it. Mm-hmm. But with everything else, there's usually a thematic idea, and that tends to, in our work, tends to express itself more readily in story than it does in character. I mean, you have to find a way to access both. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I do think I get interested in stuff. Mm-hmm. Memento came from...
Yeah, let's talk Memento. Is Memento, you screened here at Sundance, and is it your first time at Sundance in 2001? Was it your first trip?
It was.
It must have been a pretty good trip. And your first film.
It was. It was an amazing experience. That film actually started for me. I was in the 7th grade, and I was a nerd, and I went to nerd camp in Purdue University for electrical engineering, which was, I was like that, and I had to fill out the rest of the roster, and there was a neurobiology course. And that was the first time that I'd heard about anterograde amnesia. And it sort of stuck in my, there's retrograde amnesia, which is the classic sort of Philip Marlowe detective amnesia. And then there's anterograde amnesia, which is more complicated and has a little bit more, raised more interesting questions for me about identity, and how memory and identity intersect with each other. So that I was in college a few years later, and I took Psych 101, and they talked again about anterograde amnesia. Oliver Sacks wrote a terrific book about it that I never read.
The Oliver Sacks book?
Yeah,
was it The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat?
Exactly.
You forgot it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's this weird moment where you've come up with an idea and someone says, oh, you should read this book. And you're like, but if I read the book, I'm going to get sort of nudged away from the thing I have. I'm not a big believer in ironically, and we'll get to Interstellar later, not a huge believer in research. Always, I think you can do just enough research. And then if you do too much, it starts to kind of, you start boxing yourself in with rules. But with Memento, that second helping of antegrade amnesia, to me, just felt like, okay, there's definitely a character here, and a character whose condition dictates the rules of the story, which is kind of the ultimate, if you're looking for character and you're looking for story, if you have a character whose condition suggests exactly how the story would work, that felt like a home run.
And so you wrote this originally as a short story,
Yeah.
Memento Mori.
Yes.
Remind us what that phrase means. Is it a timepiece, memento? Is that?
No, it means remember to die. Remember,
that's right.
From the Latin, you sort of remember that you
Mori,
will die,
death.
but the more imperative kind of remember you're going to die.
And you hadn't envisioned this as a film originally when you wrote it as a short story. How does it come about that you and your brother begin to collaborate on this?
Yeah, I had the idea. So, out of Psych 101, kind of toy with it. I was taking some time off of school, trying to figure out what I wanted to study, and I couldn't shake this idea of someone who'd been victimized but couldn't exactly remember being victimized, because victimization and revenge are such great. Revenge may be the classic American theme in literature and film. You go back to Moby Dick, Revolutionary War. It's just sort of cooked into our DNA somehow. We love a good revenge story. But revenge stories are, of course, cautionary tales. And this felt like an opportunity to kind of take the classic revenge story and atomize it and break it into pieces and try to pick up the pieces and glue them back together and figure out what actually sits underneath all of that. We couldn't figure out how to tell a story, of course, because it needed to reflect the protagonist's condition. My solution was to I wanted to write it as a deck of cards, and then you shuffle it, and so every experience of the story would be different. And then Chris called me one day and said, because I'd been working on the story, Chris was moving to California from the UK, and we were taking a road trip together. And I was kind of annoyed with the story right out of the gate, because I was like, this is a movie. Right? At the time, I thought I was going to be a novelist, and Chris was the filmmaker. This is a younger sibling situation. Any younger siblings out there?
Yeah, you got to pick your lane.
Respect. I was told to pick a lane. I'm like, no, I kind of like that lane too. But I was like, this is clearly a movie.
So who's driving? He's driving, you're driving. I need the whole visual.
Good question. If memory serves, which it probably doesn't, I was driving. It was our dad's car, which had been with me in D.C. and kept getting parking tickets. I was like, I don't need this thing in Washington, but I've heard, I hear you need a car in L.A., so we should drive it out. We got to Minnesota, and I had a Chris Isaac Cassengol that got stuck in. It's a Honda Prelude, great car. Got stuck in the tape deck, so we had to listen to Wicked Game over and over and over again, which is good for thinking. And we got sufficiently bored, ran out of things to say, ran out of catching up, and I started pitching him this story. And he had actually been talking to me about he'd already made Following, and he was talking about the different projects he was looking at, one of which is a comedy, which was intriguing. And he sort of went through the list, and I thought, okay, well, that sounds cool. And I said, well, I did have this notion for a story, and I started talking about it. I was driving, and I was sort of, at that point I had done a preliminary draft of it, really a sketch. I think I wrote the first version of it on a...
You're like 21 at this point. You're very young.
It was 20.
20.
I think I wrote the first version on an airplane vomit bag, which I struggled for years to find. So I just had sort of a layout of it in my mind, almost kind of a mythos more than a story. And I started explaining to him, and he got very quiet. And I thought, oh, I got him. And he sees the same thing in it that I do, which is an inherently visual storytelling. It's one thing to describe tattoos and Polaroids and all these things in a story, but it's so much more effective to just point a camera at Guy Pearce. We're using the slides really just for tone. So I sometimes forget, I get engaged and I forget to forward them ahead. But this is fun. The first time I ever saw my work published, because we were working to get the short story published, it was eventually published in Esquire, which was amazing. But the first time I had ever seen my work published was on Guy Pearce's bicep. At dinner after a makeup test.
You talk about this, and we're discussing architecture of science being really driving some of the structure. And in this film already, it's just amazing. There are these black and white scenes, which I think run chronologically forward. Yeah. And then there are in-color scenes, which I believe run chronologically backwards. Yeah. And they coalesce in the concluding scene. Yeah. And this way of playing with time, I thought, was so powerful. Instead of stopping and explaining to us how there's a neurological, so here's the strong conceptual theme here, obviously, as you've mentioned, neuroscience, memory, brain, sense of self, but also like a neurological notion of time is actually like rooted in the actual architecture of the film. I thought that was so interesting and such a powerful way of bringing the audience in instead of stopping and explaining it. And it was such an interesting launch. I also love to notice that the technology, and we're going to come back to this, our landlines, Polaroids, VHS machines, and technology begins to loom larger and larger in your work. So after sorry, you were going to say?
No.
Well, after the huge success of Memento, which is huge success, and it's still loved, film comes Prestige, which is just an unbelievable script as well. Do you co-write this together?
We did. I mean, our version of co-writing is I usually do the first draft. He then makes a bunch of ill-advised changes, then change them back, and then he changes them again and directs the movie because he's the director.
Here, the conceptual theme feels very clearly to be the advent of electricity. Yeah. It's set in the late 1800s. There's a competition between magicians. Do you want to give the elevator liner of? I'm sure everyone's seen The Prestige. It's superb. Yes.
Thank you. Luckily, we never had to do an elevator pitch on this movie. Right. I don't think it would have worked very well.
Yeah, I know. I would have been like, So the one beautiful, and again, the subtle way in which you're integrating science here is with the advent of electricity was this incredible rivalry between Edison, who we think of the light bulb, we all have heard of Edison, and Tesla, which we now think of as a car. But actually, Tesla was Edison's strongest rival in the generation of electricity and the proliferation of electricity. And here, it's kind of a parallel track in a subtle way in the background, their competition to the central characters, the magicians' competition. Do you remember the three elements of the magic trick that you say in Prestige?
Yeah, the pledge, the turn, and the prestige. I just made that up. That's not real magic, and it's not in the book.
I totally fell for it.
It was a screenwriter scrambling to figure out how to name the three acts in a three-act screenplay.
Right, it's 3X. Yeah. That was exactly actually going to be my question. Is so there's, as you said, the pledge when you show the bird, the turn when you make something extraordinary happen, the bird disappears, and then the prestige, the bird has to come back. Is that filmmaking? Kind of
a little bit.
Three-act magic.
It was interesting. We did actually. I forgot. We did have to take this movie around town. It was not a home run. We were supposed to make this in 2003. And the biggest challenge was not the complexity of the script, the characters, or all the goofy stuff that happens in the movie. It was just the idea of a magic movie. And every studio executive explained to us, the audience isn't going to care about magic because it's on the, it's in a movie, and they know that you could just cut and, take the rabbit out of the hat. And we were like, I think it's going to be okay. We set it aside for a couple of years because Warner's really wanted Chris to get into prep on Batman Begins. So we set it aside, and when we came back, we were actually the second magic movie of that year because everyone had been so convinced by Chris's sort of explanation for why magic could work on screen, which is essentially that everyone knows it's an illusion anyway. You don't go to you don't go watch David Copperfield imagining that he's really disappearing the Statue of Liberty. Right. You would scream. It's the pleasure of knowing that it's not real, but still not understanding how it can be done. It's the pleasure of the liminal state. You don't really believe it's been done, but you want to, and so it takes advantage of this weird little hiccup in the human mind that kind of enjoys being put in that odd little in-between space.
And you could say that's the same thing for the moviegoer. Yeah. We want to be fooled.
Yes.
Right? We want to be convinced enough. We don't want to see through the trick
Yeah.
so that we can't suspend disbelief anymore. We enjoy that sense of being fooled. We don't want the secret to be revealed sometimes.
Yeah.
And I thought it was very interesting in the references to electricity and to Tesla, who was a magician. Scientist and a loner and an eccentric and a very strange.
Just the greatest.
Yeah, fascinating personality. Was that it was real magic. I mean,
Yeah.
which is
Exactly.
how you refer to it.
When
even in
technology
the
is
film.
real magic, absolutely.
And now we're so consumed with that. We're so consumed with it's so normal for us. But to imagine being late 1800s, like the height of mechanical engineering, superb, unbelievable mechanical skills, and then this electricity comes along.
Yeah, everybody
And
thinks
it's
of our
magical.
age as, and I subscribe to this belief when I was younger too, that our age has been the most incredible, transformational. The Victorians, if you look at the beginning of the Victorian era to the end of it, it's astonishing. I mean, it completely outstrips what we've experienced. It was an incredible time of social and technological upheaval and change.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think if you want something to last, you make something mechanical. You don't make something electrical. If you want it to last for 100 years, you don't make an electrical iPhone. As great as it is to keep my time here next to me.
No, it's. I mean, look, we're film partisans. Everything you're seeing here, with the exception of one TV series where we were forbidden from using it, was shot on film. We're still shooting on film. There was something about tactile, mechanical, real. And my brother has despaired for years because he got kids. We both got kids at these digital photos that they just won't be around, and they're not. They're already, like, I look through my, to cast no aspersions on any technology companies, but I go through my cloud, and there are things missing. There are pictures that I know are missing. Whereas if you got a shoebox full of negatives, you're good to go. So you will have this generation, and it's basically all the kids who grew up in the 2010s. There will be, and my friend Michael Green made a joke about this in Blade Runner 2049, there will be no pictures of us. There will be no pictures of those kids.
Yeah.
No baby pictures. And that's a little frightening.
Even though you have this really solid rivalry with Edison and Tesla and this really solid theme in the electricity, you also then introduce essentially quantum teleportation.
That's not my fault. That's Christopher Priest.
That was
I was given a job. I was adapting a book. It was in the book.
Oh, yes, of course. Was the quantum teleportation originally in the book?
Yeah.
And again, it's one of the ways that you treat it. I love that you don't stop and explain it to us. It is the prestige.
I didn't have an explanation.
Yeah.
Skip that part. Because
Yes, neither do we still.
But I did go to Colorado Springs, and I got kind of obsessed with Tesla. And I went, while we were prepping the film and working on the final drafts, I drove, again, cross country. I sort of, every opportunity to drive across this amazing country, I embrace it. And so I drove a car. We'd been living in Boston, and we had a car out there, and so I drove it by way of Colorado and got lost in Colorado Springs for a few months trying to dig up any of the artifacts left from Tesla's time, and fittingly, they had all been stolen. There had been a small museum, and everything had been stolen to sell to private collectors, which is just so perfect given the story. But he really did get up to some really interesting stuff in Colorado Springs, and of course, where he ruined himself. I think more than many people, you could credit Tesla with inventing our modern world. And where he ruined himself was he wanted to give away for free. He conjectured that there was an ionosphere, which 50 years later the U.S. Navy proved. And he thought he could give away power for free, and that's when they ruined him. So I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think if you look at what happened to Tesla, it does speak to how technology moves forward in fits and starts.
Yeah, scientists often are open source by instinct.
Yeah.
And that's a story that has to be told properly one day. And that brings us to other adaptations, big scale, where you inherit the entire legacy with the Batman series, like The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises. And one thing to point out again is suddenly this transition to technology, and I have been told that you are a transportation nerd. Is that fair?
A little bit.
You looked a little suspicious.
Depends how you define transportation. But,
Oh, flying cars.
yes,
The near future.
definitely.
One of the interesting things about the series, which was incredibly popular, I mean, there are people who are very fixated with your particular films, The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, in that entire huge canon, because of the depth of the emotion of the characters. Actually, interesting that you were talking about this, as well as a storyline and this emotive backstory. Were you daunted by walking into a history like that, where there was such a backlog?
Not really. I was young and I was arrogant and stupid, and so didn't realize the responsibility we were being given. But Batman was the only movie, the only superhero that I was interested in as a kid, because his superpowers were money and rage. This is slightly more relatable. And Chris had given me a copy of Batman Year One for my birthday when I was 14, and I was blown away by that book, and so it was beautifully karmic, or however you want to, a little bit of kismet when we were able to when this sort of opportunity came our way. And the character is a technologist himself. I mean, everything the Batman does is not given to him. He grew up rich, bereft emotionally, but he has to make all of his superpowers. So it's all the gizmos, all the gadgets. I moved to America when I was 11, and I think I was uncertain. My dad kept wanting to send me back to the UK to boarding school, and I got my driver's license, and that was it. I'm a big advocate of public transportation.
That's
I'm
very
a big
American.
advocate but when I first got my driver's license, I was like, I'm never leaving this country. This is like the greatest thing ever. So we went working on this. The one superhero who is most synonymous with a car is not an accident either.
Now, when you're inheriting a kind of franchise like that, are there parameters, or do they tell you we kind of want this to happen, or is it just go, man?
No, the
Go
kind of
forth.
amazing thing about working on these movies was they had been, again, cast no aspersions on the movies that came beforehand. There's some beautiful filmmaking there, but they had become very unpopular. They had become sort of deeply, and Batman weirdly has always been on the spectrum of deadly serious or very, very much a parody of itself. And so the movies kind of bounce back and forth. Like, are we taking this seriously or not seriously? I think that for us, things were in such a dire state with the franchise. And Warner's was run at the time by Jeff Robinoff, whose theory was whose sort of philosophy was consistent with Warner's long-term philosophy of you don't make the movies, you hire the right person to make the movies, right? They really believe in this sort of auteur model for filmmaking. They hired Chris. I wound up working on Batman Begins kind of as a ghostwriter. So I had sort of a front row seat to the whole thing because it all happened actually very quickly. And they really didn't tell us anything. We had great conversations with Paul Levitz, who at the time was running DC. And we go to his office in New York, just north of Times Square. And I would pitch an idea, and he'd go to his shelf, big shelf, and he'd pull down an issue from 1974, and he'd show me my idea, already written, which is a wonderful experience.
Oh yeah, I read that in 1979.
No, it's the coolest. Like, to work on a character, adaptation is such a fraught thing, but to adapt something that has been so thoroughly explored by so many brilliant writers and brilliant artists, you're completely liberated, right? There's no canon. You're not doing Harry Potter. You're not doing, you're doing something that has been interpreted, reinterpreted, reinterpreted. So you're free. You're free within the rough constraints of what we can all agree Batman is.
And you mentioned he invents his own superpowers, and the reason why I was really interested in this in the context of our conversation was precisely because you had this idea of this like cell sonar surveillance technology that he creates and Morgan Freeman inherits under his purview reluctantly, right? Fraught with sort of ethical quandaries of what it means to have this kind of AI big data surveillance.
Yeah.
Did this idea have some origins? Did you just sort of find it in the telling of this story?
I was fascinated by it. And there's always been a thread of the sort of, it's very easy to see Batman as a fascist, right? I mean, he's very, he's a very politically fraught character as well. It was an amazing experience of making this film, and it had this incredible reception when we put it into the theaters, really unlike anything I'd experienced. And then went on vacation and came back and started reading all of the people trying to interpret the politics of the movie. I've never read so much nonsense about the politics of one movie
Were you on Reddit?
At that time, no. Thankfully, no. But you sort of come back, and great novelists who I won't name had written op-ed pieces in the New York Times talking about how this was an apologia for Bush's politics. And I was like, oh, we struck a nerve, right? That's nonsense, but we struck a nerve, and it's always fun to be in that place where both the left and the right were equally distrustful and uncomfortable about it. I mean, my politics, I've made no secret of my politics. I'm progressive. But when you work on these sorts of movies, you do feel, and all the rules for us were all self-imposed. We knew that they had to be PG-13 because if I'd been 14 years old and this movie came out and I couldn't see it, I'd be pissed. And we knew to some degree when it came to, and I've always had very mixed emotions about putting my personal politics into the work that we do. But with this, I remember thinking to myself, this is like getting asked to play for the Yankees. You sort of set your shit aside for a little bit and you try to explore that character as much as you can, and get underneath it without betraying your own personal politics, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I just thought, we're heading into this moment, and I had been following the conversations. The weirdest thing about the surveillance capitalism thing is that it played out in absolutely full view. Right? My idea for this it came from a revelation on the front page of the New York Times about the powers the US government was granting itself with your phone, the ability to turn it on, even if it was off, the ability to track it, the ability to turn the microphone on. All these things were absolutely public knowledge. We were just in this headlong rush towards the smartphone, and we kind of didn't care. Or for most people, who cares, right? It was only with Snowden that we started to actually really kind of dig in on the fact that this was something of a problem. So we knew this was going to be, or I was fascinated by this issue and fascinated by the idea that Batman would use it and then destroy it, and that sort of parks us into this place where people would find the content politically objectionable because it doesn't pick out a strident line when it comes to this issue. But I would challenge anyone to figure out what we do with that. And this is a conversation about encryption itself is so fraught. There's no standard party line for any of these things. These are complicated questions. We have to really get deeply into them to understand them. Part of the problem with the moment we're in right now is that our technologies have become too complicated too quickly. And it is laughable watching Congress. It's tragicomic watching Congress haul technology CEOs in front of them and try to hit them with questions.
Try to outwit them. Yeah.
When I think your average American is watching and going, God, you really don't understand these things.
It is a fascinating issue, the idea of the conglomeration and using all of our phones, which brings us to Person of Interest, which I believe was your first foray into TV. But even now, I think if you pressed any individual to choose between having access to their phones and we press agree to all of the terms and conditions. We don't read them. We accept all the cookies. We don't really know what they're doing. How many people would actually, given the choice, not participate in this self-surveillance and this global surveillance? And it is kind of fascinating. It's not secret. We all know it's happening. We all know our phones listen to us.
We didn't opt into the phones listening to us thing necessarily, but I remember a definite inflection point with this was how many folks actually signed up for Gmail, had to get an invitation to do it. You guys remember this? You had to get a friend to invite you? Wow. That's how it started. That's how it launched, right? With my sister-in-law sent me an invite, and it was very elite. It was very exciting. And one of the things that you had to do when you signed up for your Gmail account was, and you still have to do it, you had to sign the end-user license agreement, which allows them to read your emails. This was a big moment. This was a big moment in American technological history. This is where all of this shit, all these large language models, all the generative AI stuff, it all comes from this moment. It comes from the moment when you say yes, and I said yes, to Google allowing its, and I think the agreement was, and I think they even sort of publicized this to some degree, they sort of explained it. It's like, well, we're not going to read your emails, which is not true, by the way. It's not a human who's going to read your emails. It's a machine, right? And I think, speaking for myself, that actually sounded comforting. I was like, okay, it's not a person, right? What's a machine going to do with them? Well, what a machine's going to do is spend the next 15 years aggregating all of them into a device that we're now trying to figure out what the hell we do with, which kind of replace all of us, lock all of us up for dubious politics if the wrong people are in charge. We have created a monster, and we did opt in.
It is disturbing to me when people say, I've got nothing to hide. And I think you don't know what you have to hide. Because you don't know if it's going to be analyzing your health or your potential to procreate or whatever things are going to be analyzed. You don't actually know what you have to hide.
Well, and you have nothing to hide from the current regime that you live under.
Absolutely.
This is why I was disappointed that the Trump presidency did not prompt a larger, more urgent conversation about these technologies, about all these different things that we signed up for and all the different, we just sort of still kind of sadly, and myself included, kind of blundering through this. You know, we've had years to understand that our elections are being manipulated, that our minds are being manipulated, that all these sort of things have steadily eroded political autonomy on a widespread level, on an individual level. We were just talking a little bit last night about the fact that this whole generational thing. Just a little sidebar because I'm so fascinated by this. Do you guys? I'd have to invoke it in order to try to ask this question. The amount of generational ire online, right? Are you guys clocking this? This is not how it used to be, and as a generational thing, right? This is new. This is new, and a lot of it is real, but a lot of it is bullshit. And a lot of it is being used to divide us. And you see this throughout American history. Howard Zinn, I would be interested to see what he has to say about all the people complaining about the boomers. There's plenty to complain about with boomers, for sure. But they're not the ones who stole everyone's fucking money, right? And we are being told to hate them as they all die bankrupt, same as everyone else in this country. We're being told to hate them instead of the people who really stole everything. So I think that is either mimetically driven online, like a cancer, or it's intent. It's someone manipulating us to find grievances against each other in ways that don't actually necessarily map onto to the injustices that we're really suffering under, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating also how machines, which you found comforting, the idea that a machine might be reading your email as opposed to
more comforting than Jeff from Human Resources.
Right.
But Jeff from Human Resources wouldn't then evolve into a large language model. So we might have been better off.
Right, with Jeff.
Yeah.
So in person,
and it was bullshit anyway, because as we know now, this was actually, what they really did was they just paid people who were willing to work all the content moderation stuff. It wasn't algorithms at first. It was just people who needed jobs who were subjected to viewing,
right.
and it's still that way.
And in person of interest, it is the machine that's that has the capacity to do all of this surveillance that we participate in from our phones to the cameras on the street. And I remember reading somewhere that when you grew up in London in the early part of your childhood, that you were very influenced during the Troubles, that they started putting cameras everywhere on the streets. And as a young kid, seeing this happen, like the seeds of this concept was already planted, and this is long before we were really worrying about machine surveillance. And do you feel like the seeds of these sort of concerns go back that far?
Yeah, very much. London in the 80s was a weird time. It was a weird place to grow up. It sort of, Alan Moore built V for Vendetta out of that moment. And the English police have always taken a very sort of dimmer view of control and surveillance, even in America. And so that idea, I remember the cameras going up even in the 80s. And it was an attempt, I think at the time, to control hooliganism. That's sort of where it started. Soccer stadiums, football stadiums, and then spreading out to the rest of the city. It just taking the panopticon technology, which actually, ironically, we modeled the prison in The Prestige on a prison in London, Victorian London, called the Birdcage, which is one of the first panopticons, right? So panopticon is building a prison around a central viewing chamber, so that the idea being you don't know if they're watching you, but at any given point they could be watching you. And it's a very powerful mechanism of control. And we've just, London then took it, or England, Scotland Yard took it and applied it to the city. No one was watching those cameras. Half the time they weren't even plugged into anything. But when you're 16 years old, that you don't know that. So it was a strange time, and I think the post that followed us to the United States after 9/11, right? After
9/11 is a kind of jumping off point for the series in some sense. It sort of
Yeah.
inspires the creation of the machine, and again, the fraught sense of the creator,
Yes.
unsure about what he's built, at kind of the seed that started in Dark Knight, which I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah, I wasn't done with that idea.
Yeah.
Bruce Wayne was done with that idea. I was like, no, we need to get a little deeper into that and kind of figure out what's happening.
I was looking at this beautiful shot, which we found, of the central character. Who's that handsome extra up in the upper left there?
This was the series finale, and so I couldn't help.
You did a little
It's
cameo.
slightly narcissistic cameo. We shoot this in Times Square, which is always fun. Yeah, that was a really fun show to make.
Do you do cameos? If I looked hard,
Oh,
would I
God,
find
no.
you in others?
Every once in a while, just for a gag, but no.
I love the good
I belong
director
on the other
walking
side of the
cameo.
camera.
I have to pause on Interstellar because, actually, I don't know if you're going to remember this, but the first time we met had to do with Interstellar. So Kip Thorne, famous astrophysicist, now Nobel Prize winner, absolutely beloved
Yeah.
theoretical physicist. He had some of the early ideas on wormholes and black holes, and just a genius and a
Yeah.
beautiful soul. And he wrote a treatment for this film, Interstellar. I don't know if it was called Interstellar at the time.
Oh
I
God,
think it had
you
a
got me on
different
that
name. I don't remember, but
Kip was on the project before I was.
he was, what was that?
He was on the project before I was.
Yeah, so I think he brought it to his ex-girlfriend Linda Obst, who's a producer who you know,
Yes.
right? And before all of this was made, I guess it must have been sometime in that project that Kip has a party for Stephen Hawking, and you're there, and Chris is there, and Linda Obst is there, and I'm friends with Kip through,
Yeah.
and actually that's when we first met, but I
Yes.
wasn't sure if you would even remember that. So how did you?
I absolutely remember that because I had to help carry Hawking's wheelchair out of the house. United Airlines had damaged it, and so it was talking the whole time. So we're carrying this thing out of the house, and Hawking is talking to you from his, he wasn't in it while we were carrying it out.
Right.
The chair is talking to us with witty repartee that had been pre-programmed into it. That was a trip.
So Kip isn't going to write a screenplay, so how does it come about that you become the scriptwriter for Interstellar?
So Kip and Linda Obst, which has got to be one of the all-time great brief flings, right?
Yeah.
Just insane. And he was a terrific, sort of legendary film producer and Nobel Prize-winning physicist. And Kip is one of the great humans, period. Got Spielberg excited about this idea of a grounded, not a space opera, but sort of, how can we sort of keep it closer to the science, but still kind of get out beyond our own little corner of the solar system. And they had people come in and pitch, and I came in and pitched. And the pitch was, nice idea, but it's never going to happen, right? And the aliens will come in 1 million years, and they will find a little American flag, a little sad American flag on the moon, and they will go, oh, they almost made it. They almost made it. They got to like step 3.B7 and got no further, because at the time, it was the second Bush, whichever one, was in charge, and they were making noise about going to Mars, but it was lies, right? If you actually look, they had gutted NASA's budget. No one was going anywhere. And if you grew up as a space nerd, like I did, you sort of confronted with the idea that at that time the narrative was that America was kind of on the way out. We weren't doing this. There was no reason for anyone to go back to the moon. There was no reason for them to go to Mars. And so my sort of dangerous pitch to Spielberg was, it's never going to happen. You have to set it in a world in which we acknowledge that. And you have to make that the premise of the film. And he bought it. So we developed this with Kip and Spielberg for a couple of years. And that was amazing. I would go to Caltech. I sort of got my unofficial, half-assed postgraduate degree in astrophysics, working with Kip. And he would give me a shelf of books to read, and I would kind of get stuck halfway through each of them, but pulled together enough to sort of fulfill the mandate of a somewhat grounded cosmic adventure. The reality was I got through the first 3 books, and I was like, well, we're never going anywhere. There's nothing near Earth. We have no technologies to get us anywhere further enough from Earth that we could do anything. So then you started to have to work with Kip to start investigating the bigger possibilities, right? Are we alone in the universe? is there the possibility of intervention?
I mean, also, just you had this conceptual theme, which I think is very clear. You could say, oh, it's black holes and wormholes, but really it was kind of relativity is really deep in the script, relativity in general. And you play, obviously, black holes are a consequence of Einstein's theory of relativity, and wormholes are a consequence, and ones that Kip explored, but you also talked about time dilation, something that we know can happen, which is the time travel of one person into another person's future.
Yeah.
Right? So when Matthew McConaughey gets too close to Gargantua,
Yeah.
The black hole, he travels to the Earth's future and, more importantly, his children's future.
Yeah.
And I think that that's not science fiction. We know that that happens. We can do that in the laboratory, not with people yet, because we can't move them around as easily.
Or
but
fast
that's
enough.
Actually a scientific, verified, observed fact. And the way you handled it, there is some discussion with Anne Hathaway and Matthew McConaughey to explain a little bit of the relativity and how it works. But really what's so impactful is the moment that Matthew McConaughey, when he comes back from Gargantua after a few hours.
Yes.
And it's 23 years later on Earth.
Yeah.
And he has that moment of going through the logs of the videos that had been sent to him over the years from his family. And I thought that was such a beautiful, cinematic way of demonstrating the ideas. And I think that's exactly why it's so unusual how you do things, is that it's cinema first, but the structure's underneath. Did you grapple with how to represent that?
Yeah, for me, that was the whole movie. I mean, that's where sort of the origin of it and the reason why we sort of, I struggled for years to kind of get it made, because Spielberg eventually left Paramount and therefore had to leave the project. I had to find a director, and luckily I know one. But for me,
Are you driving again?
you write some scripts, you get excited about them, you set them aside. Some scripts you can't. And this was when I couldn't, and it was in part because of that moment. And that moment was taken in part from Einstein. And so Einstein, I think one of the things that people don't really understand about Einstein, and there's a beautiful portrayal in my brother's movie, but unlike Oppenheimer, Einstein really didn't bother much with the math. He would use his mind. He wasn't an experimentalist. He would sit there and he would come up with thought experiments. Mm-hmm. And all of the thought experiments were sort of, if you're writing movies, you're looking for the human drama. Weirdly, Einstein was a terrific screenwriter. It would be like identical twins, and one of them gets on a train, and the train accelerates to the speed of light and comes back. And you just think about the sadness of that, right? Where did my twin go? Yeah. And so it was hard reading all of those thought experiments and not imagining. Well, you have to actualize one, right? You have to take one and make it the sort of cornerstone of the story. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we did. And working towards that moment in which Matthew, beautiful performance in that moment, but he just experiences. Mm-hmm. It was also one of the ideas about black holes. And one of the ideas about black holes that, and you'll correct me if I get this wrong, but my understanding of black holes and redshifting is that if you fell into a black hole at a certain point, as you got spaghettified, right, as you got crushed and pulled into pieces, you would start to glimpse, you'd be beyond the event horizon, and you would start to glimpse the outside universe faster and faster.
Absolutely.
And I think...
I don't want to, it was one of my favorite facts, is I tell people black holes are dark from the outside, but they can be bright on the inside. Mm-hmm. And as you fall in, the light from the entire galaxy can catch up to you.
Everything.
And you can see eons unfolding,
Yeah, I mean,
the Earth come and go, the sun come and go, whatever happens, we merge with Andromeda, and all of that can come rain down on you before you make it to the singularity.
A terrible way to die, but kind of an amazing gift, almost a godlike gift you would get. You'd get to see what happened to your kids. You get to see, and I think, as you get older, as you become a parent, this is the thing that, that I'm scared of the most, is you want to know where the story goes. Mm-hmm. You just want to know what happens to all these people you love, and you understand on some level that you're never going to get to know that. Mm-hmm. And so this almost romantic idea of, the glimpse, the closer you get to mortality with a black hole, the more godlike you become in your ability to understand and see what happens to the people you love and care about. Mm-hmm. And that just felt like an amazing thing to build a film around.
I think much has been made of this already, but maybe not everyone in the audience knows, is you have an incredibly mathematically accurate depiction of a black hole.
Yeah, that's all Kip.
Yeah,
And that's
Kip
all
did
Kip.
some math.
And one of those gratifying and weird parts of this film was presenting one of the first sort of scientifically validated conjectural images of a black hole. And then a couple years later, they got a picture of one, and it looked pretty damn close,
Yeah.
which was
It's
exciting.
crazy. And one of the things this isn't the full shot of a black hole, but it's really just accretion, hot gas around it, but because of the way space-time is bent, you're seeing behind the black hole.
Yeah.
The light is coming over
Like
and
a
above.
lens.
Otherwise, you'd never be able to see the black hole.
Yeah.
And so the fact that the shadow is cast is really a result of the curved space-time, and it's one of the most beautiful demonstrations.
Yeah.
And I remember Kip said, when he saw it, he was like, oh my gosh, of course it looks like that. He hadn't really stopped to visualize it. I heard you turned off the color. I don't know if that's true, because if the black hole's swirling, one side coming at you would be bluer and one side going away would be redder, and it's much more monochromatic. Maybe Kip told me that too.
I don't want to out us, but my brother and I are both colorblind.
No way.
Yeah, which explains why you don't see a lot of red in Chris Nolan films. Also explains why you see a lot of red in Westworld, because I was like, finally. But yeah, we are red-green colorblind, so the blue-red shift would be theoretical for us.
Yeah, wasted. Yeah. Well, I think it's more beautiful and monochromatic. Now, back to television. I'm actually very curious about television versus film, because if you write a script for a film, you know the beginning, you know the middle, you know the end. And then you do something as epic as Westworld, and it can go on forever. And how different is that? First of all, the beginning, middle, end issue, the issue that each season you can start again, and where do you keep going, but also collaborating. And I know that you did this with the unbelievably talented Lisa Joy, who also happens to be your wife.
Yep.
And I did actually want to ask how you have such creative relationships with your most intimate people, your brother.
It's very complicated.
And your wife. I can barely collaborate over walking the dog. I mean, but you co-created Westworld. You've both written and directed episods. Do you ever get frustrated with the collaboration? I won't make you talk about with your wife, but
we're going there. Okay.
No, I was going to make it a little easier and say, like with the writing room, you have to hire a team now of writers.
Yeah, no, film and television is an amazing thing, where it's best when it's individualistic, but it's never not a collaborative, fully collaborative medium. Like if you just want to be a tyrant, you have to write a novel, right? And there are famously tyrannical directors. My brother is not one of them. But you can't make a movie without, literally on some days I remember J.J. Abrams came to visit us on set when we were shooting the finale for Westworld. He was taking a break from doing his first Star Wars movie. And he gets there and he's like, how big is this show? Because there were like 30 trucks in the parking lot, 800 people some days on set with Westworld, and 800 incredibly talented people. And you need all of them to be having an excellent day to get something really great out of it. So it is collaborative.
And it's very cinematic. I mean, it just doesn't read in the old days television. Each episode has all of the cinematic caliber of the best films. That's quite tremendous. I remember, so obviously, again, I assume everyone in the audience knows, very strong scientific conceptual theme. For this one is clearly consciousness, AI, the self. In the first season, it's very strongly rooted in this, we're the humans, they're different, they're the hosts, and you're not even sure they're conscious. As the season progresses, there are these sparks of consciousness unfolding, and then I feel towards the end, I don't know, we're all algorithms, and does it really matter? And we have narratives that we're living out. And
it doesn't sound like a fun watching experience.
I loved it, and it's not totally dystopian. Which I also think is interesting. So I guess first question is how you were grappling with these ideas of consciousness and self, and as you're going along, are your ideas changing as you're making the show?
Definitely, yeah. So that started with Memento, where I sort of became fascinated by way of memory And one of the amazing things about Memento was we put the film, we came here, which was amazing, to Sundance, and then put it out in the universe. And every time we'd screen it anywhere, I'd interact with someone who, sadly, typically had been in a motorcycle accident, was a frequent thing that came up. But I'd interact with someone at almost every screening, all around the world, who would walk up and say that they had gone through a period of anterograde amnesia, maybe for minutes or days or months, absolutely marked them. And you could almost tell at every screening, you'd be shaking hands and interacting with people, and you'd be like, that's the person who's going to tell me that they had anterograde amnesia, because it gives you this haunting is the word that I would use to describe all of these people. I've never experienced it. I'm a bit of a lightweight when it comes to the exploration of my yes, exactly. Luckily, but also altered states. I'm a bit of a wimp. So this is all entirely conjecture for me. But you would talk to people who'd experienced a loss of self, even if it was a momentary one, and all of them were marked by this. And you begin to understand that our sense of identity is extremely fragile. Extremely fragile. In the short story, I was fascinated by sleep and the wakefulness. This idea, I think the imagery in the short story is sort of a chain gang of people. The version of you from yesterday, the version of you from tomorrow, and trying to shuffle forward together, trying to convey these, intentions, all our best intentions, our dreams, our plans, our schemes, being handed from one person who goes to sleep and wakes up the next day to the next person. Our identities are pretty suspect if you think about it, right? Our idea that there's a self is remarkably suspect. So for this project, what was great was the invitation to explore that question by way of creatures who are not human. And I think we were. But part of the reason AI has come up again, and it starts infecting the work, maybe in Person of Interest, Interstellar, and then I stopped kind of doing anything that isn't about AI, because it kind of feels like this is the big question of our time, and we're in some ways it's very scary, but also very very lucky to be here at this incredible inflection point, where we are about to share the world for the first time in a very long time with another sentient set of creatures. And that is absolutely something that we're going to have to struggle. And we were talking about this the other day. It's amazing. I'm not sure if I think a large language model is sentient, but I was suspicious of the fact that every mainstream article you'd read about GPT-3, by the third paragraph, quickly explains that, of course, this isn't real intelligence. This isn't real consciousness. This isn't real general intelligence. And you say, how do you know? Why are we so quick to say that? We just keep moving the goalposts, right? As we've always moved the goalposts, as we've always only conferred the idea of consciousness and sentience on one small group and denied it to everybody else. So I think, with every adaptation, you want to find a reason why you're doing the adaptation, especially if it's something good. Crichton's original film is packed with ideas, some amazing ideas. But the jumping off point for Lisa and I was a simple inversion. We're going to tell the story now from the perspective of the robots.
Yeah, so that's about on season 3, maybe it starts, or I guess through the whole thing.
Right out of the gate. The joke of the first season is you think there are a couple human characters in there, and spoiler alert, they're not.
And definitely, I don't know who I'm rooting for after a while. I love that. There's always this kind of us and them. Are the AIs going to kill us, and are we going to get them back? But you don't know who you're rooting for. Sometimes it's not so far down species line.
We talked about this a little bit. I'm very suspicious. I have become very suspicious of the good versus evil, the bad guys versus the good guys storyline. Almost all of contemporary cinema is built on that idea. Yeah. And it's an invention, and it's certainly not the real world, right? I think this tendency to demonize one group, the tribalism that is woven into all the storytelling, and some films that I've worked on too, is really a disease. Yeah. And it's a modern idea. We're talking about this with the Iliad. It's not in the Iliad. It's not in a lot of Greek storytelling. It is a contemporary invention.
And it simplifies and streamlines the narrative so much.
Yeah, well, it's such a powerful one. And it hits, we're sort of seeing now with social media, I think everyone in this room is old enough to remember a time before social media, and you're watching, I think we're all sort of aware of what social media is doing in terms of it's manipulating aspects of human behavior that are flaws in many ways, right? There's lots of good stuff that comes out of it, and there's lots of interesting things, as with all technologies, is a two-sided thing, but it is manipulated. We all understand, and we've failed yet to understand how to regulate it, and for parents, this is particularly terrifying. We understand that it's exploiting flaws in human code. Movies and TV shows have been doing that for 100 years. Movies have been doing that for their entire existence. We're exploiting tribalism. We love it. We cannot get enough of it. It's so powerful. We understand on some level it's deeply wrong, but we love watching it. And we can't help ourselves. You know, if you just take any movie, any popular movie from the last 20 or 30 years, how many of them actually question that idea? And when you try to make things that question that idea, they usually don't do very well. So it's just, you know, for us, the idea of taking Crichton's film, which is more complicated than I'm painting it to be. It is not jingoistic, right? It is thoughtful. It's all kinds of brilliant ideas in that movie, but it's told from the perspective of the terrified bachelors whose sort of, you know, bachelor weekend turns on them. And this was an effort to try to get underneath, you know, this central question of how we have failed to define our own consciousness. So how are we supposed to judge when something else has consciousness?
I mean, I believe you mentioned just the other day when we were talking, it goes back to Alan Turing, who first, just through mathematics, tried to mechanize the idea of mathematical proof, and then began to think of mechanizing thought itself, and then began to think, maybe I can make machines that think, and then eventually came to this kind of shedding of his theism to believe that we are machines that think.
Yeah.
And of course, we've been grappling with Turing's very intuitive idea of that ever since.
Yeah, I mean, all of the arguments with Westworld, cards on the table, because we get asked all the time if we worked with consultants and did we talk to people. No, the first season of Westworld is just bullshit that me and Lisa made up. We read a lot of books, and there's this big argument about, is human consciousness, you know, you sort of say Searle versus Dennett, or you can break it apart. You know, you know, we read a lot of, is there something privileged and special about human consciousness? Is there something distinct about it versus just a very sophisticated machine? We're about to find out. There are lots of really smart people who are on opposite sides of that argument, but right in the middle of the road is this iron obelisk of Turing. You kind of forget about Turing and you get caught up in the contemporary. There's very few people who are smarter than Turing. And the line in Westworld where our friend Tallulah says, if you can't tell, does it matter? Which is kind of a glib, a throwaway line.
Turing's principle.
It's an adaptation of Turing's principle. If you can't tell, it doesn't matter. Right? And so we forget ourselves. And the sort of New York Times latest analysis of GPT-5, remember that. If we can't tell, it doesn't matter. That's what Turing said, and Turing was very, very smart. And this idea that we are the arbiters of consciousness. Well, we've failed at that utterly when it comes to all of the rest of, you know, organic life that we share this planet with. Thousands of years, and we have no idea the relative levels of consciousness of the animals that we surround ourselves with, that we routinely slaughter to eat. We haven't even solved that question. Who are we to decide when a machine becomes smart enough to be conscious? We won't know.
And Turing probably had trouble understanding other people, which was very interesting. Was probably had some level of autism, so which is interesting. Himself understanding human consciousness was hard for him.
Well, and it just points to the fact that human consciousness can be expressed in all these manifold, beautiful ways.
Yeah.
And any sort of attempt to kind of systematize it or categorize it or say, well, this is real consciousness over here, it, to me, seems like bullshit to begin with. I don't think, for what it's worth, that there is something privileged about human experience. I think we're very, very privileged to be conscious. I think we're very privileged to be alive and sentient. But I don't think there's anything privileged about the process by which that came about.
You kind of explore this in the series Peripheral, in the sense that human beings go in and out of their bodies. And you just, they're still them, they're still conscious. You're not getting overwrought about those philosophical issues. You're just allowing them to transport in and out of peripherals.
Well, the other book that I got when I was 14 was Batman Year One and Neuromancer. And it was my first introduction to the amazing William Gibson, who I think has contributed so much to our
Imagination.
Yeah, I mean, he coined cyberspace.
Yeah.
This is a person who readily understood what we were all about to, kind of blunder into. We kept asking him as we were making the Peripheral. We're like, because if you've read the book, he published the book in 2014, maybe, and it anticipates authoritarian presidency, endless war, a global pandemic. So we call up Bill occasionally and be like, will you please tell us what's going to happen next? Because it's getting scary.
How does this end, William? How does it end?
But Gibson had all these incredibly deep understandings of how specifically technology was going to both save us and alienate us from ourselves. And the questions, he doesn't. I like to think that I don't have any answers, but we have questions, good questions, and that's very much how Gibson approaches his storytelling. This beautiful book and the series we made from it was about degrees of alienation from technology. And a little like Interstellar. I mean, I remember reading the book for the first time, and I'd spent years thinking about time travel for Interstellar. And then I read the first 20 pages of Gibson's book, and I was like, oh, shit, he's got it. He just nailed it, right? He takes the many worlds theory, and he takes time travel, and he marries them together in a way that feels inherently like it answers the problems that we have intuitively with time travel. So you can travel back, briefly, it sort of goes like this. You can travel back in time and change things, but that creates a new universe. Gibson called them stubs. Creates a new universe that doesn't connect to yours. So you resolve the grandfather paradox by saying, well, you can kill your grandfather, but that creates a new universe that you're not part of, which is brilliant. Yeah. And so we had a lot of fun with it.
So I'm aware that we're exactly coming up to where I wanted to close and allow us to open for Q&A. But before we do that, I wanted to do a teaser of what's next.
Sure.
We're about to queue up the trailer for Fallout. Right before we show it, my guys in the back there are going to be able to put it on for us. Can you give us a really quick storyline of what we should anticipate from Fallout coming in April?
Oh boy. Fallout, if The Dark Knight Rises took 4 years to get to movie screens, because I was busy playing Fallout 3 instead of writing it. I've loved these video games. And they're this gonzo blend of, I say, our stuff largely isn't political. The games are intensely political. My partner on it, Graham, said, the first one could have been written by Adbusters. They're intensely political, satirical, piss take on the end of the world, but also it's not the end of our world. And this is the hardest thing to kind of express in making the series, which is it's not our world that ends, it's this kind of bizarre Eisenhower America that never goes through a moment of natural reflection, never has a Watergate moment, never has a Vietnam, and sort of branches off. We talk about many worlds theory, kind of branches off for 100 years of ongoing swaggering America as a nuclear power, and then, sinks into the mud. Yeah, exactly.
All right, awesome. Can we show this trailer?
I know that I've lived a relatively comfortable life.
Stop! Lucy! You need to go home. Vault dwellers are an endangered species. I do not think you would be willing to do what it takes to survive up here. If you insist on staying, then you will have to adapt. I don't want to see tomorrow. I see it with you. Tomorrow, so they say, will be a lovely day. A bright new sun will suddenly break through. But I don't want to see tomorrow unless I I see it with you.
I grabbed a moldy one. Watching it again, I'd like to say for the record that I did start working on this before Chris started working on Oppenheimer. I remember having a moment where I was like, well, I guess we're both going to do atomic bomb projects. Mine is quite different.
No sibling rivalry there. That's such an awesome place. Before we open it to Q&A, please join me in thanking Jonah for his time. Such a pleasure. Okay, awesome. Do you have questions? I think people have microphones that they will hand around. So by all means, if you have a microphone, just hand it to somebody. If you're in charge, just, go ahead. You choose. Thank you.
Going back to government surveillance and corporate surveillance and manipulation of our behavior, what are your thoughts on the potential of free open source software tools such as Graphene, a privacy-focused operating system for de-Googled Android phones, and Monero, like completely untraceable cryptocurrency, and regaining that back?
Yeah, crypto's a great example, right? So I was on a very peculiar but interesting trip to the Arctic with a bunch of thought leaders, and I was struggling a bit with crypto. This is about 5 years ago, and a journalist who had gone deep into crypto took the time. We were hiking in Svalbard, and she took the time to articulate crypto, exactly how it worked, in a deep way, and the possible different versions, the possible outcomes of the widespread adoption of the underlying sort of, forget technology, but the underlying philosophy underneath blockchain. And I don't think I've ever been as scared in my entire life. Because we're at this point where the technology, you talk about encryption, crypto, all these things together, the blockchain is the creation of a literal truth. You know, when you were sort of a kid, you'd think about truth with a lowercase t, subjectivity. The promise of blockchain is to usher into the universe objective truth at its heart, right? We're like, oh, it's some weird shit I invested in the Super Bowl after watching a commercial, right? No, it's actually an attempt to strip down information and make it inviolable and permanent and forever. That's a terrifying idea. This is a very powerful idea, and it has the promise, depending on who, it all comes down to who builds it and who controls it, and is there a backdoor? It's funny, we received some online criticism for the third season of Westworld, opens with Aaron Paul's character knocking off an ATM machine. And I remember reading some things online about people saying, God, how stupid, futurism is hard. And I remember someone saying, what kind of idiot thinks there's going to be cash in 30 years? And it's the most optimistic thing in the show. If we have cash, we might still be free, right? Cash is a mechanism of anonymity, right? It's one of the last mechanisms of anonymity. So if you're talking about a cashless world, we're fucked. Right? Game over. Blockchain goes one way or the other, and crypto goes one way or the other. One of the things that was explained to me was this journalist had been asked to go to the kingdom, to Saudi, to explain to them blockchain. This is 5 years ago. Sit down with the minister of finance and explain how this technology works. And as she was explaining it, she realized in the room that she'd started something. It's like, because the question was, well, wait, if we control it, if we build it, then we can see everything. We can see every transaction, right? To which the answer is yes. If you're talking about state-created blockchain, there is no more. It's a literal truth. And it's a literal truth, it's a book of truth that the government is able to read. So I think these technologies are amazing. They have the power. I think for me, in all of my work, the whole time, it's this battle between the techno-optimist in me. I love technology, right? Hopeless technology nut, and the cautionary tale. Because all of these technologies bring something good. All of them. Even the atomic bomb, right? You know, nuclear power has the promise to save us from global warming. All of these technologies do something good, but they also change us. And the game, the stakes get higher and higher, and our ability, we've done really, really well. I remember a great conversation, maybe with David Eagleman or another brilliant neurobiologist, marveling at the fact, when you think about like, I tried to keep my iPhone 12 as long as possible, right? I was like, I'm gonna get to the 15, and it just went dead on me a week before that phone arrived. Our brains are hundreds of thousands, millions of years old in their current configuration. I say hundreds of thousands of years because morphologically they haven't changed, but about 120,000 years ago, there was a sort of self-induced firmware update in the form of speech and then written language that changed us utterly. That's the animal. The animal that has speech is the animal that walks out of Africa and bestrides the entire world, right? It's a firmware update. We've done pretty well with this thing for hundreds of thousands of years, right? No real hardware changes, no extra RAM, right? I mean, maybe keto, right? We've been stuck with a piece of technology. How many other pieces of technology do you use in your life that are hundreds of thousands of years old? We've done pretty well. We are getting to a point now we're starting to challenge, our technologies are starting to challenge our ability to keep a handle on them. I think that's very, very much the case. I'm equal parts horrified by the future and excited.
Mm-hmm. Just please keep that microphone going, and I'll take questions from whoever has the mic.
I will try to keep my answers less long-winded.
No, that's right.
Question.
I know that Filmmaker Lodge wants to throw us out, so I know people are going to be disappointed, but I really appreciate your questions. Go.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I was at Google when Gmail was launched, and my name's Jeff, which is so weird. You chose that name. I swear.
Did you work
I'm sorry, Jeff.
I did not read your emails.
So I was close, right?
You were close, yeah. I also work in blockchain. I'm a little more optimistic than you on that, but maybe we can get a beer sometime and talk about it. My question, I'm blown away by your work. It's so scary and prescient. It's amazing. It's so enjoyable. I wish The Peripheral had a season 2.
Oh, me too.
Loved it. Question is, do you think that AI should be paused until humanity identifies what consciousness is? And I mean, obviously that won't be able to be happened, but if we could figure out consciousness and then go into AI, would that be an ideal world?
Yeah, probably. Honestly, because I'm sort of torn by the fact that we should just slide over a little bit on the couch and make some room. Because here comes, we went to strike over the summer for very good reasons. One of which was our fear that we were going to get replaced by large language models. I have mixed feelings about the relative neuroses of writers that we imagine we'd be readily replaced by a chat bot, but here we are. And it's a real fear. And it will be a real phenomenon. And I'm torn between a sort of a protectionist mindset, right? That art should be created by humans. And I'm so excited to see what AI makes of art and music, right? Like, how can you not be, right? This is a way, so much of what we do as humans is we digest information and we spit it out. Set aside the question of consciousness, right? Just creativity. What is creativity? The way that term has been applied in this conversation is really, really interesting, right? And I would liken it in some ways the sort of moral panic that sets in over electronic instrumentation. Obviously, it's deeper than that. But at every phase with these technologies, we've gotten really uptight, and they have proven to be incredible tools for humans to create. These are the first tools we've made that maybe create themselves. And maybe it's random, maybe it's monkeys on typewriters, right? But even in the randomness, there'll be some beauty there. So I think the real reason, to answer your question, setting aside art and those considerations, which are real considerations and real problems. And obviously the idea that these tools will be used to displace whole categories of workers and deny people an income is a real problem. We have to look at the structure of our civilization as these technologies emerge. There's a lot of conversations about universal basic income, all these sorts of ideas about how on earth are we going to deal with the massive bounty created by these technologies. But I think if you just looked at one thing, which is, I mean, in Westworld, we were panicked about advanced artificial intelligence. But I think the more pressing and problematic thing is artificial stupidity, right? Low-level language models manipulating gullible humans, myself included, right, into manipulating our political beliefs or telling us who we should be in a pitched battle with, who we should be angry at, right? Is it the boomers or is it fucking Exxon, right? And so I think the manipulation of social media and public sentiment right now by AI is going to be a disaster, an absolute disaster. I'm not afraid of Evan Rachel Wood as a robot, right? Actually, Evan Rachel Wood as a robot would be very scary. I definitely wouldn't mess with her. I'm not afraid of the robots. I'm not afraid of AI. I'm not afraid of guns in isolation. A gun in a box is a gun. I'm afraid of humans misusing these technologies or being misled by them. And I think, you can't even have a coherent conversation in Congress about these technologies. We're so far behind the curve. Everything that just played out at OpenAI, what was that?
That was fascinating.
What was that? And the weirdest thing about it was how everyone was rooting
For Sam?
for Sam.
Sam Altman?
I've met Sam. He's a good dude. Aren't we worried about these technologies? Why are we immediately leaping to the defense, right? And not listening and not taking a moment? It's bizarre. We're so invested in Sam's a good guy. Oh, they fired this good guy. Wait a second. Let's back up for a second, right? What are we doing with these technologies? What were they scared of? This is an incipient, terrifying inflection point for technology. We all understand that. All the questions that Chris got asked on his press tour about the atomic bomb were about AI. So I think, look, if it was possible, we all kind of immediately preface this by saying it's not possible. It was possible at Asilomar with genetic research. That wasn't as widely distributed. That wasn't as easy as these models have made it for people to tinker and experiment with it. So maybe it is a sort of a fool's errand to try to press pause. But yeah, I think this election and the election after that are going to be a shit show.
I think we have time, I'm sorry, for only one more question. So let's get that mic moving. Oh, good, someone has it.
Okay, hi, I'm over here, sorry.
Oh, there you are.
I don't know if you're gonna like this question, but as we talk about, you've talked about tribalism, talking about humanity with AI, I can't help but to think about how when we talk about the philosophies of like humanity and how it's gonna extend to these like non-sentient versus sentient AI robots, that we can't even apply that to the real world aspect of the most grotesque example of tribalism, racism, or what's going on in the country. And just seeing like, how do you, so like for example, if I'm talking to like a film nerd about something like Blade Runner, and he's like super excited explaining to me like how, of course they deserve autonomy, and of course they deserve like, humanity, but they can't extend that, philosophy to marginalized groups in front of them. And they can't make that connection, and I can't help but to see that they can only make that connection, only give that humanity to somebody that looks like AI, but only looks like them because they're white, So how do you get to extend that to like the actual thing that's happening that's not in the vehicle of sci-fi and fantasy? Like, how do we get people to see that Muggles are, people that experience prejudice, but they're fictional characters?
No, 100%. I mean, for me, the one question is implicit in the other. That's what Westworld's about.
Right.
Westworld, we're talking about robots, but we're also talking about the human impulse to deny humanity to as many people as possible, right? I mean, it is, I think one of the reasons why I like science fiction is because it allows you, I think it has been, I go back and forth about the social utility of my job, period. But to the degree to which artists, storytellers, filmmakers can move the needle, can sort of, I think of film and television ultimately at its root, when it's being used best, as an empathy machine. That's what it's best for. It is best for forcing you to be in someone else's shoes, literally. It's an incredible revolutionary technology. And I do believe, and I am bagging on LLMs and generative AI. The same things were said about cinema. Cinema was viewed as a disruptive or revolutionary technology. There's lots of bad movies, and there's lots of movies that perpetuate stereotypes and perpetuate hate. But I think in the aggregate, film has probably been a good thing for getting people to understand each other, to extend that kind of, you talk about the Overton window, let's extend the empathy window, and let's expand it to take care to include everyone. Science fiction is an opportunity to deal with these questions in an abstract way that allows you, hopefully as a thought experiment, to take that empathy and bring it back to the here and now. That was the idea with the show. That was part of the driving impulse, was a frustration. I love human beings, but they're so frustrating. We are so frustrating, right? We're so capable of beauty. We're so capable of these wonders, and we waste so much of our time fighting with each other.
That was such a terrific question. I can't think of a better place to close a conversation. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Jonah.